Hey guys, before my internet cut out, this was the last thing I wanted to go over today. It'll only take 10 minutes or so. We had already discussed everything from the last two assignments, so if you had any questions, just email me about your last two assignments. But it was just the money multiplier, or the spending multiplier, and more work connecting money supply with aggregate demand. And that's just chapter 34. So this last thing, it's Phillips curve. This is chapter 35, and it's a new graph, but it's something you're already familiar with because it just shows the trade off between inflation and unemployment. This is something we've even talked about since September because this is one of the principles of economics. So, what happens when inflation and unemployment when aggregate demand changes? So, during the 60s is when this idea first came around because there were clear relationships between government policy and what was happening with inflation and unemployment. And basically, what the trade off was is that if you wanted unemployment to go down, you had to accept higher rates of inflation. And, to some extent, that's okay. If everybody accepts that the inflation rate is going to be a little bit higher, and if that reduces unemployment, then during the 60s it's okay. Now this graph right here is in your book, and so you could take a look at page 795 in your book, and you'll see this exact graph. Well, the other things that were happening is going to be in the 70s and 80s. And what happens in the 70s and 80s is on page 796 in your book and 798. And you'll see that the Phillips curve will actually shift. So people's inflationary expectations changed. And so as a result of that change in inflationary expectations, the whole line of this Phillips curve will shift, and it shifted to the right. And the same thing will happen in the 1980s when people's inflationary expectations changed. So take a look at those two graphs, 796, 798, and you'll see the real world application of the Phillips curve. This holds true into the 90s, this inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation. And so, generally speaking, when you have inflation going one way, your unemployment rate is going to be going the other. And you see in this graph that inflation is in red, unemployment is in blue, and generally speaking, they were inverse. Now, this all stops after the Great Recession. So, after the Great Recession, unemployment really is going to shoot up, inflation will shoot down, which is holding to the model, but it's just what happens afterwards. And we've been in an era of very low unemployment right now, but also very low on inflation. So the Phillips curve has broken down in the last 10 years. And that might be true now that we have the corona recession. That might be true in the future as well. But we'll see. We'll see if this relationship comes back as we get out of our current recession, or if it's going to be permanently broken in the next coming years and decade. So here's what it is. It's a very simple graph, inflation on the Y, unemployment on the X. It is a new graph, though. We haven't graphed anything like this. So you have a downward sloping short run Phillips curve line. You can also just label it PC. And when you want to graph things, you just put numbers. So you have inflation percentages and you have unemployment percentages. So if you had an unemployment rate of 2%, that's very low. That's below the natural rate. You'd have an inflationary gap. So you'd say your inflation is somewhere around 5%. Conversely, if you're in a recessionary situation, your unemployment would be very high, 8, 9, 10%. Although where we're at now, we're approaching, we have around 26 million. So we're approaching very high numbers. We're looking at 15% right now and higher. Hopefully that's all short lived. And with high unemployment, your inflation would be very low, around 1%. So there's a long run Phillips curve. This long run Phillips curve is vertical at the natural rate. And in the long run, you're always going to go back to the natural rate. So people's inflationary expectations would adjust because that is just money. Inflation is just money. We already know that money is not manipulating real variables. Money is just manipulating a unit of accounts. And so if people's belief about the dollar changes, then their pricing will change and their expectations of wages will also change. But we do need to remember that unemployment is a natural rate and it's going to be vertical at 5%. And so that's a real variable. And so we'll always get back to your natural rate of unemployment at 5%. That point is important. I want you to remember these three things. And I'm going to come back to this slide later. Just remember, number one, that shifts of aggregate demand are movements on the Phillips curve. Once again, when you shift the aggregate demand line left or right, you're going to be sliding on the Phillips curve up or down. When we shift aggregate supply, we're going to shift the whole Phillips curve. So in the first one, this is the graph I showed you in the 1960s. Aggregate demand was changing in the 1960s, and they were moving on the same Phillips curve. If you look in your book at page 796, you'll then see the start of the 1970s, and we have a shift of the Phillips curve into the 1970s because inflationary expectations changed. Then the third point is just to remember that things will be in the opposite direction. So whether you're dealing with aggregate supply or aggregate demand, if you're doing something and you're shifting aggregate supply or demand to the right, then something on the Phillips curve is going to happen to the left. And by the same token, if you're on the Phillips curve, you're moving left for some reason, aggregate demand and supply is to the right. So they're always in opposite directions. Now, in the first point, remember that shifts of aggregate demand are movements on the Phillips curve. It's still in the opposite direction. So if you're shifting right, you're moving on the Phillips curve to the left. For the second bullet point, if you're shifting your whole aggregate supply to the right, then your Phillips curve is going to shift to the left. So here's a couple of examples. So here's your short run and your long run. What happens when your aggregate demand increases? Well, we start at a basic stable position. Aggregate demand shifts to the right, so you slide on the Phillips curve to the left. And in the long run, in the long run, we'd always have to get back, and we'll get to that later. But in the long run, then people's inflationary expectations would change. And then in the long run, we'd see aggregate supply shifting to the left because people are going to request higher wages. And so your short run Phillips curve would shift to the right in the long run, as we see here. So that is your basic short run and long run situation when aggregate demand increases. Going back to this, let's make aggregate demand decrease. So aggregate demand decreases, we enter into a recession, unemployment shoots up. Now inflation is very low, so people accept lower wages because unemployment is so high, and so as a result, inflation will drop even lower, but your short run Phillips curve shifts to the left because people are now accepting lower wages. And all prices for businesses are lower too because people aren't buying anything. So we return to full employment because that's your natural rate. So again, you just saw these key points. Shift of your aggregate demand are movements on the Phillips curve. Shift of aggregate supply is a shift of the Phillips curve. And everything shifts in the opposite direction. So those are your key points. Later on, we'll be putting together, so next class, we'll put everything together, and we'll just show the two graphs. I just talked about AD and AS. I just wanted to introduce you to the Phillips curve, what was going on, and for you to remember those three key points. And that's it. That introduces you. Otherwise, your assignment is just to finish up Applia for Chapter 34. Thank you.